The road outside Bethany is quiet. Dust settles on sandaled feet. Somewhere behind the walls of the village, someone is still weeping loud enough to carry on the wind. A crowd trails behind one man, and every one of them thinks they know what's about to happen. For days ago, a man named Lazarus died. You can still feel the weight of that number if you sit with it for days. Long enough for hope to fully die. Long enough for a body to be wrapped, sealed behind stone, and mourned by professional wailers hired for exactly this purpose. Long enough that when Jesus finally arrives, Martha meets him on the road with something between faith and accusation. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And here is where the story should turn triumphant. Because Jesus already said it out loud, days earlier, plain as anything, Lazarus is dead, and he is going there to wake him up. He is the ending. He knows exactly how this scene resolves. In a matter of minutes, he will stand in front of a sealed tomb and call a dead man back into his body. So explain this to yourself for a moment. Why does he stop? Why, on the way to his own miracle, does Jesus see Mary weeping, and the crowd weeping with her, and something in him breaks? He asks where they've laid the body. And then, before he does anything else, before he calls out, before the stone even moves, he cries. Not the loud, public grief of the mourners around him. Something quieter. Something that only one gospel writer bothered to record in the shortest sentence in the entire Bible. 2 words in English. Jesus wept. If you've ever cried at a moment that made no logical sense to cry at, the good news you already knew was coming, the ending you'd already made peace with, and the tears showed up anyway, you already understand something about this scene that most Bible teachers skip right past. You don't need the outcome to be uncertain for the grief to be real. You just need to love something that's been touched by loss. Stay with me on this, because it is the strangest detail in the whole account. A man who knows the ending is still crying at the beginning. A man about to empty a tomb is still weeping in front of it. This is not a story about a miracle. This is not a story about power. This is not a story about a Messiah who never breaks. This is a story about the handful of times, 4, to be exact, that the Gospels catch God crying. And by the end, you'll understand that the tears at Lazarus's tomb weren't really about Lazarus at all. They were the first sign of something much heavier, something Jesus was already carrying toward a garden not far from here, where the crying would not stop so easily. But we're not there yet. First, you need to understand what kind of tears these actually were, because the gospel writer had 2 different words to choose from, and the one he picked changes everything. Mary reaches him a few minutes after Martha does. She doesn't stop at the road, doesn't stand and talk theology the way her sister did. She falls, right there at his feet, in front of everyone, and says the same words Martha said. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Except for Mary, they land differently. Less like an argument, more like a wound. And here's what most people skip past without noticing. The text says Jesus sees her weeping, and sees the crowd of mourners weeping with her, and something in him is described as deeply troubled. Not touched, not saddened, troubled, the kind of word you'd use for a storm, not a feeling. This is where the Greek matters, so pay attention to this, because English flattens something the original language kept sharp. When the gospel writer describes Mary and the crowd, he uses the word kleo, loud, audible, public weeping. The kind of crying that draws a room's attention. It's the same word used later, in a different gospel, for Jesus himself, on a hillside overlooking Jerusalem. Loud, visible, grief that announces itself. But when the writer describes Jesus at the tomb, just 2 verses later, he switches words. He uses dakrio, a quieter, more restrained shedding of tears. No wailing, no collapse, just water on a face, in silence. And here's the detail worth sitting with. This word, dakrio, is used exactly once in the entire New Testament. Right here, for him. 2 different Greek words. 2 different kinds of crying, sitting 3 sentences apart in the same short scene. The crowd wails. Jesus weeps quietly. You'd think the quieter version means less feeling. It doesn't. If anything, the silence is heavier, the grief of someone who isn't performing it for anyone. But there's a third layer to this moment, and it's the one that gets lost almost every time this story gets told from a pulpit or a Sunday school flannel board. Before Jesus weeps, before the quiet tears, the text says he was deeply moved in spirit. That phrase, deeply moved, is a translator's gentle rendering of a word that isn't gentle at all. The Greek is embrameomai, and outside of Scripture, it was used to describe the snort of a warhorse before a charge. It carries anger in it, not sorrow, fury. So hold that thought for a second, because it reframes the whole scene. Jesus doesn't arrive at the tomb and simply feels sad that his friend is gone. He arrives, sees the wreckage death has left behind, a widow's grief compounding into a sister's collapse, a village hollowed out by loss, and something in him responds the way you'd respond to an enemy. Not a tragedy to be accepted, an intruder to be confronted. Think about what that means. The most famous tears in the Bible weren't only grief. They were grief laced with rage, the rage of the one being who was never supposed to lose anyone to death in the first place, standing in front of proof that his creation was broken by it anyway. You were built the same way, if you've ever noticed it in yourself. The anger that shows up at a graveside isn't a glitch in your faith. It's an echo of something you inherited from the God who felt it first. You have probably stood at a funeral and felt two things you couldn't fully separate: sadness and something closer to anger, at the unfairness of it, at the wrongness of a person who should still be there not being there. If you felt that, you felt a shadow of embrameomai. And here's the part nobody tells you in Sunday school. Jesus felt it first. Before you ever stood at a grave and felt the injustice of death, he stood at one and felt it worse. 3 details. A loud crowd weeping with Cleo. A quiet man weeping with Dacrio. And underneath both, a warhorse's snort of embrameomai, fury at the grave itself. And still, knowing he was about to call Lazarus back out of that tomb in the next 60 seconds, Jesus let himself feel every bit of it first. He didn't skip the grief to get to the miracle. He walked straight through the grief on his way there. That's the first place we find him crying. It will not be the last. And the next time, the tears come in a much louder key, not over one friend's grave, but over an entire city that doesn't yet know what's coming for it. So let's pause here for a second, because we've already found 3 different kinds of tears in one short scene, and we're not even halfway through the 4 times this happens. Loud weeping from a grieving crowd, quiet weeping from Jesus himself, and underneath both, something closer to fury than sadness, a warhorse's snort in the face of death. If you're finding this as strange and as human as I did when I first dug into the Greek here, hit subscribe, because we're about to go somewhere heavier. The next time Jesus cries, it isn't for one friend. It's for an entire city, and he can already see exactly how it ends for them. Fast forward now, past the raised body of Lazarus, past the crowds that followed Jesus afterward whispering about what they'd seen. We land on a hillside just outside Jerusalem, on a day you already know by another name. The day people threw cloaks and palm branches in the road and shouted Hosanna, as if a king were finally coming to save them. And in the middle of that celebration, as the crowd is cheering loud enough to shake the road, Jesus looks up at the city spread out in front of him. And he weeps. But it gets stranger, because this isn't a private tomb with a handful of grieving friends. This is a parade. Palm branches. Shouting crowds. The kind of moment any other leader would ride through with a smile fixed on his face, waving to the people who finally believe in him. Picture yourself in that crowd for a second. You've waited years for this king to show up, and now here he is. And instead of the triumphant face you expected, you watch him break down in tears in front of everyone. That's not the story you came for. It's not the story any of them came for. And this time, the word switches back. Remember Dacrio, the quiet tears at Lazarus's tomb, used only that once in the whole New Testament? This isn't that. Here, the gospel writer uses Cleo again, the loud, audible weeping, the same word used for the crowd of mourners back in Bethany. Jesus isn't quietly tearing up on this hillside. He is audibly, visibly sobbing, in the middle of his own celebration. Why? Because he can see something the crowd around him cannot. He tells them plainly, a day is coming when enemies will surround this city, hem it in on every side, and level it to the ground, and not one stone will be left on another. He isn't speaking in vague poetry. He's describing, in specific and brutal detail, a siege. And here's the part that turns this from a strange emotional moment into something almost unbearable to sit with. It happened exactly the way he said. Roughly 40 years later, in the year 70, Roman legions surrounded Jerusalem and did precisely what he described. We don't have to take this on faith alone. A Jewish historian named Josephus, who was actually there, documented the siege in horrifying detail. Families trapped inside the walls as food ran out, neighbors turning on each other in the streets, the temple itself burned, the city torn down stone by stone until barely a wall remained standing. He wrote it down not as prophecy fulfilled, but simply as a man reporting what he had watched happen with his own eyes. So picture the scene again with that knowledge sitting on top of it. A crowd is celebrating a king they think has finally arrived to fix everything by force. And that king is riding through the middle of their celebration in tears, because he already knows the city will reject the very peace it's shouting for, and that the cost of that rejection will be paid in a horror 4 decades away that none of them can yet imagine. This is not a story about a man overwhelmed by a crowd's enthusiasm. This is not a story about disappointment. This is not a story about a king who simply didn't get the welcome he wanted. This is a story about someone who loved a city enough to weep over its future while its present was busy throwing palm branches at his feet. There's one more thing worth noticing here, and it's easy to miss under all the noise of the parade. At the tomb, Jesus wept for one friend he was seconds from raising back to life. Here, on this hillside, there is no miracle coming, no resurrection waiting on the other side of these tears. Just a slow, inevitable collapse he cannot undo, because it is a collapse this city is choosing for itself. The tears at Lazarus's grave were followed by an empty tomb. The tears over Jerusalem were followed by exactly what he said would happen, down to the walls, down to the stones. Grief you can fix, and grief you can only carry. Jesus has now shown you both. And there's a third kind still coming, one that will make even this hillside look almost gentle by comparison, because the next time we find him in tears, he isn't weeping over someone else's coming loss. He's weeping over his own. 3 days later, in an olive grove outside the city walls, Jesus does something he has never done before in front of his disciples. He tells 3 of them, Peter, James, and John, the ones he usually keeps closest, that his soul is crushed with sorrow to the point of death. Not metaphorically. That's the actual phrase. The Greek word here is paralipos, a compound word built from around and grief. Sorrow surrounding him. Grief closing in from every side, with no gap left to breathe through. This is not the quiet dacrio of the tomb. This is not even the loud, public Cleo of the hillside. This is something past both. Grief so total that the man describing it uses the language of dying to explain what grief alone feels like. He asks the 3 of them to stay. Just stay awake with him a little further into the garden while he prays. And then he goes off alone and falls to the ground and prays the kind of prayer that a later New Testament writer would describe, years afterward, as offered up with loud cries and tears. Not composed, not measured, not the calm resolve of a man who has already made peace with what's coming. Loud, crying, desperate enough that another gospel writer records sweat falling from him like drops of blood. Now watch what happens while all of this is unfolding. While Jesus is in the middle of this, sorrowful to the point of death, praying with tears loud enough that someone later felt the need to record it, Judas is already walking. Torches, a crowd with swords and clubs. The betrayal isn't a surprise twist waiting somewhere down the plot. It's happening in real time, in the same night, while Jesus is still on his knees. So now go back to the beginning. Remember the question we opened with. Why does a man who already knows he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead still stop to cry first? You have the answer now, and it isn't the one you expected. The tears at that tomb were never really about Lazarus. They were a preview, a small, contained grief that Jesus could walk through and undo in the same afternoon. Practice, almost, for a grief he could not undo. Because this time, in the garden, there is no miracle 3 verses away. No stone about to roll back. No friend's name about to be called back out of a grave. This time, Jesus is the one walking toward the tomb, and there will be no calling him back out of it early. Not for 3 days. Not until the 3rd day changes everything. You have probably sat in a room like this one, even if it didn't have olive trees. A hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning. A phone call you already know is coming. A doctor who has already told you, gently, how this ends. And still, even knowing the outcome, even trusting it will be all right in the end, you cannot stop the tears in the meantime. Knowing how the story ends does not remove you from the part of the story you're still living in. That is Gethsemane. Jesus knows Sunday is coming. He has said so more than once. And knowing it does not make Friday hurt any less on the way there. Maybe you know exactly what that feels like. The diagnosis you've already made peace with in your head, and yet your body still shakes the morning of the appointment. The goodbye you know is coming, and yet when it arrives it still knocks the wind out of you. You've probably told yourself you shouldn't still be crying about something you already knew was coming. Gethsemane says otherwise. Even the Son of God didn't get an exemption from that kind of pain, and neither, it turns out, do you. This is not a story about a man who was too weak to face what was coming. This is not a story about faith failing under pressure. This is a story about a God who, faced with the full weight of what he was about to carry, did not perform calm for an audience. He wept. Loudly. Alone. Except for 3 friends who couldn't even manage to stay awake with him. And when the torches finally arrive, when Judas steps forward with a kiss already rehearsed, Jesus stands up from that ground, tears still fresh on his face, most likely, and walks toward the cross anyway. Not because the fear was gone, because it never had to be gone. Grief and obedience, it turns out, were never opposites. They knelt in the same garden, on the same night, in the same man. So here's what 4 moments of tears actually add up to. Quiet tears at a grave he was about to empty. Loud tears over a city that wouldn't listen. A warhorse's fury at the wrongness of death itself. And grief so total in a garden that the only word for it was borrowed from dying. 3 takeaways, and I want you to sit with the third one longer than the first 2. First, the factual truth. Jesus wept in at least 4 distinct, different ways across the Gospels, and they were not all the same emotion wearing the same face. Quiet grief at a graveside. Loud grief over a skyline. Righteous anger at the wrongness of death itself. Total anguish in a garden, alone, in the dark. Scripture never flattens these into one generic tear. It names each one specifically, in a different word, in a different place, because each one mattered specifically. Second, what that means for you. Not once, in any of these 4 moments, does anyone in the text treat those tears as a failure. Not the disciples. Not the gospel writers. Not God the Father. Tears were never treated as the opposite of faith in Jesus' own life. If crying has ever felt to you like proof that your faith isn't strong enough, look again at Gethsemane. The strongest faith recorded in Scripture wept the hardest, on the worst night, right before the greatest act of obedience anyone has ever performed. So the next time you find yourself apologizing for your own tears, at a funeral, in a hospital hallway, in your car before you walk into work, remember whose face those tears resemble. You are not failing him when you cry. You are, in that moment, more like him than you know. Third, and this is the one I want to leave you with. The same God who stood in front of a tomb he was about to empty, and cried anyway, is the same God who sits with you in front of the tombs that don't get emptied. The diagnosis that doesn't reverse. The relationship that doesn't come back. The phone call you're still waiting for at 2 in the morning. He didn't skip grief on his way to the miracle at Lazarus's tomb, and he doesn't ask you to skip it either. Some tombs open. Some don't. Not yet. Either way, you were never meant to stand in front of either one alone. Which of these 4 moments hit you the hardest? The quiet tears at the tomb, the loud grief over Jerusalem, the fury at death itself, or the anguish in the garden? Tell me below. Because here is the last thing worth carrying out of this video with you. We tend to picture God as the one who wipes away every tear. And one day, Scripture says, He will. But before He ever wipes a single tear from your face, the record shows something you may never have noticed before. Long before He ever wipes one tear from your eyes, remember this. He cried first.